All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome one and all to our Living Room Lecture Series, and thank you for joining us. Tonight's presentation is titled Beyond Publications, Exhibits and Presentations, 21st Century Historical Archaeology and the Next Generation of Community Engagement at the Nathan Harrison Site in San Diego County, California, by Dr. Seth Mallios. My name is Adam Eastley, and I'm Public Archaeology Coordinator at the San Diego Archaeological Center. I'm so pleased to see you all here, and I want to personally thank Dr. Mallios for sharing his time and expertise with us this evening. Before we jump into the lecture, I'd like to share a few upcoming events we'll be hosting in the coming months. Our next virtual lecture is in May, and it promises to be a fun one. Save the date for a field guide to archaeological oddities, frauds, and mysteries with Professor Emeritus Dr. Kenneth Feder on Thursday, May 16th. You can find more details and a link to register on our website. Next month, I will be leading a mead making workshop at Vista's Twisted Horn Mead and Cider. Join us there for mead tasting on March 16th to learn the history of the oldest alcoholic beverage ever brewed and enjoy a behind-the-scene tour of a modern meadery in the second installment of our Ancient Echo series. Mead in the History of Humanity. Registration is limited to 20 participants, so be sure to sign up sooner than later. Tickets are $50 admission, $40 for our members. Tickets include a flight of Twisted Horn Mead to enjoy during the presentation. Get yours also on our website at sandiegoarchaeology.org/mead. We're excited to announce the date of our annual barbecue, which is always a blast. On April 27th, we'll be serving up tacos from local hotspot Frida's Taqueria, alongside live music, atlatl and archery, a silent auction, and more. Proceeds support our work preserving invaluable collections as well as hosting school programs, field trips, lectures, workshops, and exhibits. Lastly, come by the museum on Saturday, March 9th for our monthly second Saturday lecture screening, where we replay some of our favorite past hits of living room lecture presentations. Next month's screenings will be Archaeological Explorations in the Western Colorado Desert by Michael Sampson, and Ironworking in Togo, Archaeological Research in the Passar region 2013 to 2020 by Dr. Philip Tavares. You can find more details on these events and other information about the center, our curation efforts, and programs on our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org, or feel free to reach out to me personally if you have any questions. Tonight, we will be using the Q&A feature, and you can find it in your Zoom control panel below. Feel free to submit questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation during the moderated Q&A. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Seth Mallios. Dr. Mallios is a professor of anthropology, university history curator, and director of the South Coastal Information Center at San Diego State University. He received his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD from the University of Virginia. An archaeologist, anthropologist, and historian, Dr. Mallios engages in scientific and humanistic community-based research that offers insight into past and present issues of identity, memory, and myth-making. Before moving to San Diego, he served as site supervisor at the 1607 James Fort Archaeological Site in Jamestown, Virginia. Professor Mallios currently directs multiple field projects in Southern California, including the Nathan Harrison Historical Archaeology Project, the Whaley House Historical Archaeology Project, and the San Diego County Gravestone Project. He has published 13 books, including Born a Slave, Died a Pioneer, Nathan Harrison and Historical Archaeology of Legend, which is available for purchase in the museum gift shop. He has authored dozens of other articles, garnered over $2 million in more than 100 external grants, contracts, and awards, and has curated many public anthropological, archaeological, and historical exhibits. It is now my honor to introduce to you Dr. Seth Mallios.
Thanks, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and it's only fitting because the very first public talk I did on Nathan Harrison was at the Arc Center, and it was a long time ago, but it was after our first season of digging, and so there's a close tie between our work and the Arc Center, and also this push for a public archaeology that not only engages with people, but continually evolves in its relevance. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Many of you have heard me talk before. Many of you are familiar with this project. So I'm going to do that little dance where I try and bring in a lot of new stuff, but also catch other folks up to speed who haven't necessarily been as well versed in what we've been up to. You can see by the title of this talk, it's pretty strange to give a presentation that's basically entitled Beyond Presentations. It's a little weird. But what we want to be thinking about here is not only beyond the dig and not only beyond the articles and books that we write, beyond the exhibits that we curate, but how do we want to have a legacy for the projects that we do? It's so difficult to do archaeology at every stage of the endeavor that sometimes we can get hyper-focused on the exact moment we're in. But I think it's time for all of us to figure out a way to anticipate the future, anticipate legal changes, anticipate social changes, and even personal changes in terms of how we want to get our material out there. So let me start our slideshow here. So the Harrison Project, the Nathan Harrison Historical Archaeology Project, it's a 20-year undertaking. We've been doing this for over 2 decades. And what our goal has been all along was to understand and communicate the life of Nathan Harrison and the legacies of San Diego County's first African-American homesteader. And we try and do this, and I'm not trying to be coy here, by any means necessary. Our historical archaeological toolkit, it sometimes is very archaeological and based on the things in the ground, but we also have scoured the archives and the oral histories that are out there, the written histories that are out there. And it's something that I call orthogonal thought, which is where you just try and open your mind and saturate yourself and your audience with all the existing narratives so you can evaluate which ones have the most validity. In a time of multiple perspectives, I think this is absolutely necessary because two people can experience the very same thing very differently. And so we're trying to bring all of this together, these multiple experiences, yet still grounding it in this archaeological reality in the ground. It doesn't matter how deconstructionist we all get, there still is that archaeological reality. And one of my favorite photos here is students working in the midden at the Harrison site. And you can see all the artifacts that are there so finely pedestaled. That is that archaeological reality. No multiple perspectives are going to change where those artifacts are found, what they are, when they date to. But that very elusive question of what this all means, that's when it gets much trickier. So when we talk about Nathan Harrison, it's important to situate him and our work. And his home was 2/3 of the way up the west side of Palomar Mountain. And he lived there from at least the 1880s all the way through 1919. And this is a remarkable individual, no matter how you measure it. Somebody that was born into slavery, endured the horrors of the antebellum South, the mania of the gold rush, and the racial injustices of the Old West. Harrison gained a mythical status during his life, and the crazy thing is it continued to grow after his passing. He was embraced by many communities while he was alive, but boy, did his story take off rather soon after his passing. And so what we're going to look at today is the history, the archaeology, but then we're going to see what has happened since the archaeology. And this is the thing that gets me the most excited about this project because we've been doing it for a while. And even though I love the conclusions we've been able to find that deal with double identity, a historical archaeology of minstrelsy, I find that all fascinating. Members of the public, our collaborators, people that we've worked with for years, have been able to take the story even further and in different ways than I ever imagined. And I think that really is become one of my biggest goals, is to have projects that people can then take this material and run with it. It's a strange sensation to think that I now want people to outgrow me, transcend me with this work, leave me in the dust, so to speak, and show how this story is relevant for them and relevant for the next generation as well. Central to all of this is consultation and collaboration. There is no archaeology. I don't think there's a history these days without consultation and collaboration. And so we're going to go into a lot of these themes today. You know, it's funny to give a little personal background on this, because usually my bio starts with Jamestown, and that's where folks first heard of me, and that's where my archaeological tale seems to begin for many folks. But I was digging at a place called Flowerdew 100 Plantation before Jamestown, and it has special relevance to how I think about all these issues, not only in the work we did at Flowerdew, but how the work ended at Flowerdew. What you're seeing on the left side of the screen there is a team photo of our archaeological field school in the early 90s. And the reason that I point this out is we're all sitting there at the base of a giant windmill. So Flowerdew 100 Plantation, it's on the south side of the James River in Virginia. It's a remarkable 1,000-acre property that has sites dating from 10,000 years ago all the way to the early 1600s and all the way through the Civil War, 10,000 years of continuous occupation. Some of you may have heard of Flowerdew 100. It's been in the news in the last 5-10 years, because that's where those first Africans that were brought to the New World ended up. They sailed through Jamestown in 1619, and they were brought to Flowerdew 100. Again, a very special site in terms of historical significance for many, many reasons. But let's get back to this windmill. So the landowners privately owned there at Flowerdew 100. The landowner was an individual by the name of David Harrison III. And he was most excited about this large property that he had on the south side of the James, because there were rumors that the first windmill in North America was at Flowerdew 100. He was fixated with windmills. He didn't have any descriptions historically of the windmill, and no archaeologists had found the windmill archaeologically. And so he built this enormous windmill. If you look at the picture there, we're at the base of it. It has these brick footings. I mean, this thing is 40 feet in the air. It is an enormous windmill. And it was his pride and joy, even though there wasn't a whole lot of historical accuracy in terms of the size of it, the shape of it, or even where it was located. This was something that meant quite a lot to Mr. Harrison, and it's what got him so excited about archaeology on his project, on his property. So in 1995, we were digging at Flowerdew, and we were digging a site that wasn't very close to where this photo was taken. It was down by the point. And what we found in the ground was one of the most unspectacular features you've ever seen. It looked a bit like a Christmas tree stand. In the center, there was a circle ring that was about 1 foot in diameter. And then there were 8 D clamps around the edges. And it had some fill in it from the early 1600s in it. This thing, it looked like the remains of a Christmas tree stand by the time you get to mid-January. So we excavated, we did the research. It turns out this was the original windmill in the New World. This was the windmill at Flowerdew 100. And boy, was it unspectacular. A single central post, probably no more than 8 feet tall, certainly didn't generate a lot of electricity. And the reason I tell you about this is this hasn't been written up anywhere. I wasn't the site supervisor on this one, so this wasn't in my purview. But the consequence of this was David Harrison was suddenly very disappointed in the archaeology, because we found a windmill that didn't resemble his windmill. And lo and behold, the plug was pulled on archaeology, and no archaeology has gone on at Flowerdew 100 since 1995, since we found the windmill, which was the reason archaeologists were digging there in the first place. That stuck with me. I know this isn't a positive tale. This isn't an upbeat way to begin the talk, but this notion of the archaeology losing out because it didn't have relevance with the public, and being so singular that it could fall apart without a single benefactor, this was shocking. And this stayed with me as I went to work at the Buck and the Sand site. There's a picture of Mauna Luapo pottery from the Buck site, the report cover of the sand site that has a whole bunch of different stamped pipe bowls from the early 1600s, and then a picture of a much younger me at Jamestown. All of this, all of these sites have something in common, and that is this notion that when the big anniversary passed, or when the big find was in the exhibit and everyone had seen it, there was a great loss of enthusiasm about the archaeology. Archaeology didn't seem to have that kind of staying power, or it was trumped by later sites that were finding new stuff. I don't mean later in time in terms of later 18th century compared to 17th century. I mean newer digs were producing stuff. And when I came to San Diego, I immediately met a bunch of great archaeologists who had experience at the Presidio, had experience at Fort Guajaros, and they had experienced similar things where their digs were fantastic in terms of what they found and how they engaged with people. But the moment we stopped digging, or the moment the exhibit closed down, it just seemed to fall from relevance. It didn't have that staying power, whether it was in school books for children K through 12, whether it was in permanent exhibitions. And so this was my question when I started with the Harrison site, was not were we going to find stuff? That was an initial question, but I had confidence in the team that we had assembled. But would we be able to have something that would continue to engage with people beyond the dig and beyond the big anniversary? I'll be honest with you. I knew all along that Harrison passed away in 1920, and I knew the year 2020 would be big for us in terms of celebrating the centennial of Harrison's passing. But I went through this at Jamestown. What happens after the centennial? At Jamestown in 2007, we had the Queen of England visit. We had President George W. Bush visit. We had, heads of state. But what happens after those folks go home? How do you have this continued relevance? So that's what I want you to think about as we go through this project. So a little bit of review on this, that I am very steadfast in my belief that this project is not about African-American archaeology or African-American history. It's about archaeology and history, that you can't tell the story of the United States without talking about legacies of slavery and of racial injustice. And therefore, Nathan Harrison, it's not the quintessential African-American story, it's the quintessential American story. And this is an individual that we don't know a whole lot of facts from the early years of his life. We know he was born into slavery in the 1830s, and as a teenager, traveled west while still enslaved by a man by the name of Benjamin O. Harrison. And they were 49ers during the gold rush. And Harrison worked in Northern California as a miner during the 50s, during the 1860s, and then Benjamin Harrison passes away. And at that point, Nathan Harrison starts to migrate southward, from north to south. Like many disadvantaged people, like many ethnic minorities, the conditions were terrible in the north, and they thought conditions would be better in the south. Turns out the conditions weren't better in the South, but Harrison managed to head all the way down to Mission San Gabriel in the 1860s and worked an assortment of ranching jobs. It was the 1870s that we start to see Harrison popping up in multiple census records in San Diego County. And then in 1879, Harrison patents land at the bottom of Palomar Mountain, land that is on Rincon territory. This is what makes him the first African-American homesteader. Not the property that we've been digging at 2/3 of the way up the west side of Palomar Mountain, but it was actually this property in 1879, down at the base of the mountain, that he patents. Just a few years later, though, he sells the property and is clearly spending a lot of time up on Palomar Mountain. He's herding sheep. He has a bunch of different industrious activities up there, and he very wisely claims the water tract in 1892 there on Palomar Mountain. It's worth noting he claims the water a year before homesteading the land. One of my favorite quotes from Mark Twain is that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. Water is a key component to any narrative of San Diego history, and Harrison's act of claiming that water was especially important. So Harrison lives up on the mountain through the 1880s, 1890s, all the way through 1919. He may have had seasonal residences there even before. And you can split Harrison's life into a few different phases while he is on Palomar Mountain. Before 1900, he's very active in a bunch of different ranching activities. But in the late 1890s is when the county widens the road. And it's also when Harrison starts entering into his 70s and 80s. And this is when things dovetail nicely because he becomes one of, if not the key San Diego historical tourism hotspot. He's there. He's part of the stage that goes from San Diego all the way up to the top of Palomar Mountain, up to the hotel that's there. And he is a sensation for San Diego. Um, Even though he had made this living for many years, taking care of sheep and cattle and beekeeping and horticulture, and he had many horses up on the mountain, it was this occupation as a tourism hotspot that people grew to know Harrison. He would greet travelers as they came up the mountain. He would give them water. They would give him food, a bottle of whiskey, a pair of jeans, and they would spend the afternoon together. And this is how thousands of early San Diegans got to know Harrison and all that he represented. This individual from the antebellum South, this individual who was the exotic other, and this individual who sure didn't seem to be like anybody else they had met before. Now, in 1919, Harrison is well into his late 80s, and he gets sick during this point, and some of his neighbors convince him to go to the hospital. Harrison had no intention of leaving his cabin. He had no intention of dying elsewhere. But his neighbors convinced him to go down to the hospital to get checked out. And he actually lives at the San Diego Hospital, which was located way back when, right there at the base of today's Hillcrest, right where 163 and the 8 meet, right by that TGI Fridays. That was the San Diego County Hospital. And Harrison lives there for a year before dying without a will in 1920. And at that point, he's put in an unmarked grave, and that grave will stay unmarked for half a century. So in terms of our work here, it's interesting. I do have to paraphrase this, that when we started working on this project, I can't tell you that everybody threw us a parade. And what I mean by that is this site is not especially early. And a lot of archaeologists, bless their hearts, still have a little bit of a bias that earliest is best. And that's something that just sticks with people, getting more excited about early stuff. And then in historical archaeology, there's this funny gravitation towards sites that have very little historical documentation. If your site is early and if your site has no documentation, it is seen as being highly significant. In fact, my dear friend and mentor, someone I owe the world to, Jim Dietz, published an article where he had zones of importance that were based on earliness and amount of documentation. And were Jim alive when we started this project, he would have had to tell me this fit into the least significant zone of importance. What my work has done and what my team has been able to do is to show that earliest is irrelevant, and that all those documents, even if you have a truckload of documents, they may be full of beans. They may not be pointing you in the right direction at all. And that's where this project has been a lot of fun, long before people were throwing around the phrase fake news and controlling the narrative. We got to see the Harrison story be full of fake news, and we got to see a lot of people try and control his narrative. So we started this project in the summer of 2004. When we got there, there were waist-high weeds and a rattlesnake living right where we wanted to dig. But slowly but surely, a great crew of students that I had uncovered the cabin, found thousands of artifacts, 8,000 artifacts, all dating from 1865 to 1918. We found the edge of the cabin. We found the sunken dirt floor, something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, writing about, is how similar it is to a slave cabin from the South in terms of its square dimensions, in terms of its small overall size, singular end chimney. This thing looks like it's nearly identical to a slave quarters from Kentucky or slave quarters from Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, except it's hundreds of years later and 3,000 miles away. Truly a spectacular structure that Harrison built. We got to see big differences between the artifact densities inside of the cabin and outside of the cabin. Again, reflective of African-American use of space that has been well documented in enslaved houses on the East Coast. That the interior of these small structures doesn't see a lot of action. The patio is where all the activity is. And something that Bill Kelso, Henry Glassy, and a bunch of other great archaeologists, folklorists have written about is that the patio itself was an Africanism. It was brought over from West Africa, a very signature architectural icon. We got to see that the cabin was clearly built by one person in terms of the size of each of the rocks that was used, yet it was perfectly laid out. We're talking about an 11-foot square with two diagonals, 15.5 feet. This is not a rhombus. This is a beautifully laid out square. And over 10 years of digging, 10 seasons, 10 technical reports, we have nearly 60,000 artifacts, and every single one of them dates to that Harrison range of 1865 to 1918. The 1865 date comes from a couple of artifacts that have early end dates, a sunken shell button and some whiteware. And then 1918, we have a couple of coins with that date on it. Now, in terms of the established stories of Harrison, we often see that the dominant narrative of Harrison was somebody who wasn't intelligent, wasn't highly skilled, and was just happy to be there. You know, spoken in broken English, in a Southern vernacular that was hard to understand, and somebody that was very non-threatening. And what was so fascinating about all of this is almost immediately when we were digging in the ground, we started seeing things that told a very different story. Number one was hundreds of fired rifle cartridges. And this was remarkable for an individual that during these years, it was illegal for him to have firearms because he was closely involved with the indigenous community and because the native population was at war with the state of California. It was illegal for anyone to sell Harrison firearms and for him to have them. And so we find hundreds of fired rifle cartridges, many of them matching in terms of these rimfire 22s, clearly from the same firearm. And this started to give this portrait that was very different, someone who was well armed as opposed to someone who was just living off the charity of others. All those census records emphasized, they checked the box, that Harrison couldn't read and write. His homestead said that he couldn't read or write. His water certificate said that he couldn't read or write. Voting records said that he couldn't read or write. And then we started finding all sorts of writing utensils at the site. Pen caps, ink bottles, sharpened pencil leads, the ferrule off a pencil, eraser from a pencil. Not subtle at all that the individual who was there definitely could write. And this is where we went back to all the documents, and it became so fascinating because we saw that in the 1920 census that was taken where Harrison, while he was down at the bottom, when he was down in San Diego County Hospital, suddenly he could read and write. And this is where it got very interesting because we started to comb through the oral histories, the written narratives, and we saw two very different Harrisons. One Harrison was the one that white visitors got to see when they went up the mountain. And then the other one was this true Harrison, this Harrison that was very close with the indigenous community, this Harrison who in fact was baptized Catholic by the chief of the Rincon people. In fact, his godmother was the wife of the chief, pictured there. And so this is where we got to see a different set of relationships. and that Harrison was deliberately putting on an act for visitors came up the mountain. For the indigenous population, for the Spanish-speaking population, for the Mexican population, Harrison was an expert on the natural environment. Harrison was a valued member of the community. And Harrison was no fool. He could read, he could write, he could hunt. He was very virile and active. But for all those tourists that started coming up in the early 1900s, this is where Harrison would put on an act. He would go and put on his oldest clothing, his most raggedy clothing. Most of us dress up a little nicer when folks come over. Harrison would dress down, and he would deliberately do this aw shucks act that was very common across the United States. Every town had a minstrel group, and this minstrel group, which mocked the way that African Americans behaved, was actually taken seriously by white audiences. This is what they thought real African American culture was. And it gets incredibly bizarre when you read Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you realize that Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin, he's a Christ figure, he's the hero of the story, he's a very strong character. But white audiences twisted the story of Uncle Tom's Cabin and turned Uncle Tom into the derisive term that we know today. The Uncle Tom, somebody who's eager to please, very subservient, pusillanimous, and so forth. White audiences have been doing this for decades. In fact, English audiences have been doing this for centuries. If you look at the etymology of phrases like Indian giver, or the etymology of a phrase like welshing on a bet, those are all English phrases where they have twisted the original meaning of the word. They've gaslighted those indigenous peoples and turned them into the opposite of what they are. So long story short, we were able to see an artifact assemblage that led to this secret double life of Harrison. And then we made this great discovery in the archives that there were a whole series of letters that were addressed to Nathan Harrison, except they were addressed to Inez Harrison. And that was his confirmation name when he was baptized Catholic by those Rincon native indigenous people. And so we get to see not only was there a double life, but Harrison's double life actually had two separate names. There was Inez Harrison and Nathan Harrison. And yes, they were absolutely the same person. So another factor that we need to talk about with Harrison is all the historical photographs. For Harrison, he's most likely the most photographed 19th century San Diegan, more than Wyatt Earp. Pick your favorite early San Diegan. Over 40 different photographs of Harrison. And this is all the more spectacular in that he lived on a remote mountain and people didn't have their iPhones with them snapping photos wherever they went. They had to plan on taking his photograph when they left on their trip. And he had to agree to be photographed. And that's where every one of these photos you see of Harrison, it is carefully choreographed, carefully posed. Harrison knew what he was doing. In all of these, you will see him looking very non-threatening and harmless, leaning on a crutch, leaning on a cane, sitting. Down here, we see him holding flowers. There is nothing about him that seems in your face, nothing about him that seems like he's claiming land, claiming water, voting, and starting the revolution. That was not Harrison. He was flying under the radar because of the virulent racism that was in the Old West during this time. So we were able to put in 10 seasons of digging leading up to 2020. And there were a lot of things with this project that were ready to set sail. Had a book that came out that was decade and a half, 2 decades worth of work on the archaeological project that tied together all of these important interpretations about Harrison. It's anthropological, it's archaeological, it's historical. We curated a major exhibit at the History Center. We had all sorts of public programming. My students and I gave dozens of presentations at the SCAs, the SAAs, the SHAs. All of this was going on in late 2019. And then you all know what happened in 2020. Best laid plans, COVID hits, and suddenly everything comes to a grinding halt. this magnificent exhibit that we designed at the San Diego History Center that was about packing in as many people as possible, and that was about having everyone touch as many artifacts as possible. Suddenly, no one could touch anything. Everyone had to be 6 feet apart, and it had to be as much virtual as it was in person. Great credit to all the team members on this project. My students, over 100 students have worked on this. They are incredible. They deserve the lion's share of the credit for this, but also our community partners, our African American Advisory Board, the different indigenous groups we've consulted with, the folks at the San Diego History Center and other entities in Balboa Park, historians, Palomar Mountain, historians in Julian have been absolutely essential to this. They saved us, and we were able to put together a fantastic exhibit that, if you can believe it, is now in its 4th year at the San Diego History Center, and it includes the reconstructed cabin. What often gets lost is that we never saw the cabin reconstructed when we were there at the site, because all that was there was just the rocks in the ground, just the foundation. It was the History Center that actually showed us the first time what that full-size cabin looked like. Absolutely spectacular. And the dynamism, the evolution of this project, as we construct this exhibit, as we curate this exhibit, we're still digging. And lo and behold, one of my grad students finds Nathan Harrison's wedding band, finds a brass ring mixed in with other refuse from the exact right time period. Everything lines up perfectly for this. A spectacular find, probably the most exciting find that we found at this site. And we had to redo part of the exhibit again, because suddenly we do have an answer to that question that had stumped historians and archaeologists for generations. And that was Harrison married? In fact, at Harrison's de facto memorial on Palomar Mountain in 1923, the person giving the eulogy said Harrison had never been married. And then a rumor went through the crowd. People started whispering to each other, wait, he was married. He married an indigenous woman. In fact, he was married twice to 2 different indigenous women. Well, archaeology saved the day and was able to answer that question, even though it was tricky to be swapping out artifacts mid-exhibit. But that, again, taught us to be very versatile. One interesting thing that shifted as well, and this shifted with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as COVID, as well as our project maturing. And that was initially the push of the exhibit was to be a 100-year anniversary of Harrison's passing. You heard me say that at the outset. I've seen the power of anniversaries. I saw what it did for Jamestown. I saw what it did for San Diego State with 125th anniversary last year. And I knew what it could do for Harrison. But with the murder of George Floyd, with Black Lives Matter, I decided that I wanted this exhibit, I wanted this project, instead of starting with the anniversary and then talking about racial injustices and inequity, I decided that was backwards. I now wanted to lead with all of the myths about freedom that were taught in terms of the Old West. I wanted to take that on first. In essence, 2020, which was the anniversary year, the centennial year, the events of 2020 made 2020 irrelevant in terms of being a centennial. And this is where our exhibit, I'm very proud of the work that we were able to do, because suddenly we were able to say, this isn't about Harrison the individual. This isn't a 100-year party of Harrison. This is about upending traditional Old West narratives that need to be corrected. And myth number 1 that we're all taught was that California was a free state when it entered the Union. Not even close. Thousands of individuals stayed enslaved. African Americans, Indigenous Americans, Chinese Americans. There was nothing free about the free state. Somehow, when we're taught California history, it's like, I don't know, it's like 1849 is mixed together with 1968 with the Summer of Love. And that's just not accurate at all in terms of this myth of racial harmony. Some of the greatest racial injustices were in California. The harshest bloodhound laws for chasing fugitive slaves, California enacted those. California was no free state when it joined the Union. The second myth was that California stayed out of the Civil War. I grew up in California. I heard this all the time, that California didn't play a role in the Civil War. And when you go through the history, when you study this period closely, you see that Southern California was decidedly pro-Union during the Civil War. That is why there's so many Confederate markers in Mount Hope, the city cemetery, why there was a Robert E. Lee elementary school in San Diego County until very recently. The South has a pronounced tie to Southern California. And it's because of settlement patterns. More Southerners migrated to Southern California and more Northerners migrated to Northern California. And they took their baggage with them, literally and figuratively. And then the third myth that I think that we've done a good job of busting was that the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, was a time of racial equality and prosperity for California. It was a pronounced time of inequity. And this is something that when you look at different marginalized groups, the Mark Twain term gilded for the Gilded Age is perfect because it was nice and shiny for the elite groups, but it was a ripoff. It was cheap and worthless for those disenfranchised groups. And that is a key part of this story. The project kept evolving, and again, I want to give credit to the San Diego Art Center, because when we ended up tracking down the Harrison firearm, the first time I ever presented that was also at an Art Center talk, and it was an Art Center Zoom talk to boot. So we have a legacy there. The fantastic Palomar historian Peter Bruggerman had been trying to track down Harrison's original firearm, and he recalled meeting with the Douglas family in Orange in Southern California. They allegedly had Harrison's rifle. And the provenance was great because the Douglas family descends from Leo Douglas, who was an acclaimed mountain lion hunter, lived on Palomar Mountain, and befriended Harrison while Leo was a kid. And Peter Bruggerman visited the Douglas household. The weapon was passed down from Leo Douglas to Herb Douglas, and Peter remembered seeing this weapon, but unfortunately, we lost contact with the Douglas family. All I knew was that A. Douglas in Orange County had potentially had a weapon belonging to Harrison. So we looked on all the online sources, all the social media sources, did everything we could through Facebook and everything else, weren't able to find the folks we were looking for. So I wrote postal letters to every Douglas in Orange County. And it was a very bizarre letter that I'll read the start of it just because it cracks me up. So I wrote this letter and sent it out. It says, "Hello there, please forgive the intrusion. I'm not trying to sell anyone anything. My name is Seth Mallios. I'm an archaeologist from San Diego State. I direct a research project on Nathan Harrison, an important San Diego County pioneer, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me track down some information." And then I tell the story of Peter Bruggerman seeing the rifle, and then the letter ends. So my slightly bizarre questions are, do you have any forwarding information for Herb and Eleanor Douglas or the descendants? And might there be an old rifle in your closet? Any help would be greatly appreciated. Lo and behold, of the dozens and dozens of letters I sent out, one struck gold, and I got a call the following Thanksgiving from somebody, Donna Douglas, who said, "You sent my parents a very strange letter." Donna could not be more gracious, direct descendant of Leo and Herb Douglas. Turns out she had Harrison's firearm, and she donated it to our project, and it is now part of the exhibit. But this is where it gets a little crazy, is it's not a rimfire 22, it's a double-barreled shotgun. The date on it is perfect. It has a National Arms Company mark on it. That was only produced for 6 years because they were bought out by Colt. It's a great TPQ. And there are 12-gauge shotgun shells at the site. And then in the summer of 2021, we found a powder flask charger, the little brass part for pouring the powder in, and we found the powder flask as well. It had severely deteriorated, but it left us with yet another mystery, yet another exciting find, yet another addition and transformation of our exhibit. But it turns out Harrison had two weapons, the rimfire that does show up in one of the photos, and this double-barreled shotgun as well. That is very exciting and is now part of our collection. And so when we bring this all together, we talked about orthogonal thought. We talked about opening our mind and appreciating all these narratives, even those narratives that were changed by politicians during the 1950s in a very propagandistic way, in a very racist way, if we're going to be honest. We see many different stories of Harrison, and I want us to be able to appreciate all of them. This is an individual who definitely was a pioneer, was an acclaimed mountain man, yet also performed this minstrel act. And he was able to negotiate between different cultures in a way that very few individuals have. It's worth noting that Harrison homesteaded the property, which gave him the title of the land according to the US government, but he was also given that very same land from the Rincon indigenous population. Harrison found a way to have permission to own the property from all the key stakeholders in the region. And what he gave back to those Rincon natives was he allowed them to pass through the property to visit all their seasonal sites atop Palomar Mountain. He built his cabin very strategically close to the spring so he could provide water for people, but also right next to the indigenous trail that was leading up the mountain. This was somebody, he was the nexus for all peoples. Harrison even worked for Lewis Rose for a time, way down in San Diego. An individual, Harrison, was able to connect with different groups in a way that was unlike anybody else. At times he chose to live alone and be apart from people, and at times he chose to play tour guide. All the myth making that's told about Harrison that followed Harrison, we can't lose sight of the fact that he also created his own myths. He also had some fun at the expense of visitors and told a lot of tall tales, and that led to him being a legend. So let's get to Beyond the Dig now. This is where it got really exciting for me because in those post-COVID moments, we got to see different creative individuals taking the Harrison story and doing new things with it. The first one was San Diego State's artist in resident, a woman by the name of Zeal Harris, who came to San Diego State in 2020. And she decided, as part of being an artist in residence, she had to do a big work of public art. And this is what she did. It's called Recipe for Acorn Grits, and it features Nathan Harrison. Top left corner there, you actually see Nathan Harrison there at Billy Goat Point, there on Palomar Mountain, and he's hanging out with the artist. He's hanging out with Zeal, and they're sharing a smoke. And the great thing about this mural, one of many great things about it, is that it is all about the ethnobotany of the region as well. It's rigorously researched. She brings together cartoon art. She brings together historical figures. There's the Robinsons on the top there. And all the different indigenous knowledge of the local plants and ties it together in this mural entitled Recipe for Grips and a Recipe for Acorn Grits. And you can see her blending together the Southern meal of grits with acorn recipes by the local indigenous populations. And this was her statement on the installation. Recipe for Acorn Grits depicts some of the first documented African-American residents of San Diego County. After gaining freedom from slavery, many Black citizens made their way to San Diego seeking paths of survival, often intersecting with ex-Confederates, former slave owners, and others who sought gold, land, opportunities, adventure, and beautiful weather. This artwork also acknowledges the land and the botanical practices of San Diego's indigenous peoples who formed a bond with African Americans through their shared struggles with manifestations of white supremacy. Although it could be classified as a history painting, Recipe for Grits represents the ongoing task of finding and maintaining peaceful places for the kindred spirits of Black and indigenous peoples to thrive together. So I love that she was able to take our work and unite it with so many other important projects in the region, bring together different cultures in the spirit of Nathan Harrison, but go even beyond Harrison and make this relevant for the 21st century. Suddenly we have art, new art on the Harrison story. So I was absolutely thrilled with this. And then things got even better because a local high school student by the name of Shakur Jackson toured our exhibit at the History Center. In fact, it was his teacher that attended an Arc Center talk that tipped the first domino on this whole project. And then Shakur read our book and wrote a play called The Legend of Nathan Harrison. He wrote it, he directed it, he starred in it. It was one of the greatest performances I've ever seen. And it was called Code Switcher, The Legend of Nathan Harrison. And what Shakur did in this play was he tackled the issue of who gets to tell Nathan Harrison's story. Now, I want to emphasize here that I didn't write this play, that Shakur didn't consult with me on this play, that I had nothing to do with the actual text of the play, and that when I saw it for the first time, I was on the edge of my seat wrestling with this issue of, do archaeologists have the right to tell the story of Nathan Harrison? It was a brilliant play, something that we all need to grapple with. It's okay to be uncomfortable with these issues. We should be uncomfortable telling other people's stories, even if it's based in scientific archaeology. And Shakur was able to do that in a way, but he did it as an 18-year-old young Black man talking about his familiarity with code switching, with minstrel acts, with putting on an act for somebody else. I absolutely love this play and am more excited about Shakur's work than probably any other aspect of the project, except for the work of a few of my grad students. Chaley Gibbs just finished a thesis that took all of our Harrison work and turned it into a K through 12 curriculum. She wants to go on to doctoral work and wants to make this a reality. And then my graduate student, Jamie Bastidi, is taking an aspect of the Harrison project and researching it that no one has touched on yet. And that is these issues of Harrison's masculinity, how he was able to walk this line by being masculine, but at the same time being Black and dealing with all the deferential sides to ethnic minorities in the early 1900s San Diego, but at the same time embracing the mountain man, the Wild West images that tie together this Palomar local. Absolutely brilliant work. Now, back to Shakur. My hope was that I would have been able to tell you that Shakur has turned this into a screenplay and it's ready to be made into a movie. Well, he is working on the screenplay, and I'm excited about that. And I thought I had connections in the movie making business. Carl Weathers was a friend of many of us at San Diego State and was excited about local Black playwrights, local Black actors, local Black screenwriters. And we were devastated when Carl passed away a couple of weeks ago because I thought he was going to be the key to the Nathan Harrison story. In fact, I thought Carl Weathers would star as Nathan Harrison in Shakur Jackson's TV or movie adaptation. And then I got to work with some of my students as a consultant on the fantasy movie, The Lost City. We were able to work with Paramount Pictures, Paramount Pictures on The Lost City, directed by Adam and Aaron Nee. And I thought we had connections. Maybe they would take on the Nathan Harrison story. But unfortunately, they are fast at work on the He-Man movie that'll be coming out soon. So the Nee brothers will not be producing this. So what is this future for the Nathan Harrison project, this post-dig, post-exhibit, post-presentation Harrison future? It's all about this notion of education, collaboration, thinking in new ways about how archaeology can tell stories that everyone needs to hear. That is public engagement. But I think it all rests on these brilliant young people that have helped with the project. This is the official passing of the baton. I am more excited about the work of the next generation of archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, and muralists, and screenwriters, and actors, and so forth, to see what they can do with this project, because that is truly how I think this work can live on beyond digging, beyond artifacts, beyond exhibits, and even beyond the articles and books that we write. Thank you for your attention. I'm now happy to take questions or have help addressing the questions in the chat.
All right. Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. We are now going to begin the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, please enter them below. We will start off with actually a question that popped up early. You mentioned the excavation suddenly stopped at Flower 200. Do you think there's still more archaeology to do there?
Yeah, I know there is. So this was a working farm with the main cash crop was peanuts, but there was also a lot of corn. And what it meant was every year they plowed the land. And when they plowed the fields, boy, you'd be in an area where there was all this brown dirt, and then it would look like snow. And that snow were pipe stems and ceramics. There are a bunch of amazing sites there. One of the big bummers about Flowerdew is there was a reality show that was all about pot hunting, and they filmed an episode at Flowerdew 100. And so that's something that a lot of us have tried to spread the word that this kind of thing needs to stop. But yes, there are dozens of sites at Flowerdew that need to be dug that are still there.
Oof. Okay, next question. Do we know, did Harrison get some sort of compensation from the tourists who stopped by his cabin?
Yeah, so when I talked about the K through 12 curriculum that Shaylee Gibbs, my grad student, developed, what was so fantastic about it was she had these lessons about Harrison from every different grade. And so when the kindergartners heard this story, they were just in charge of writing a postcard from visiting the mountain. But the 12th grade one, the most sophisticated one, was about gift exchange. And what Shaylee was able to spell out very nicely in this curriculum was Harrison gave the gift of water to those visitors. He could have sold the water. It was his water legally. And there were lots of people selling things on the mountain at the time. But when you sell things, that changes your relationship with somebody, especially if they think you might be gouging them. You know, if you charge a lot for that water. And so what Harrison would do is he would give the water away and he would start this sequence of gift exchange that brings people closer. Gift exchange, gifts bespeak relationships. And many anthropologists from Marcel Mauss through Claude Lévi-Strauss, Henry Glassie have talked about how gift exchange is the key to these social bonds. The funny thing is two reciprocal gifts are the same thing as a trade. You know, it's the same thing as payment with money in terms of the goods being transferred, except suddenly we love each other and we're closer because I gave you a nice birthday gift, you gave me a nice birthday gift, I gave you a Christmas gift, you gave me a Christmas gift, instead of, you know, charging each other for the gifts. So Harrison gave that water, and people knew that he was going to give them water, and they came prepared to give him stuff back. And this is one of the funny things about the site, is for a site that only had one person living there, we had over 200 buttons. Everybody kept bringing Nathan Harrison pants. And so if we didn't have all the documentation, we would have thought a lot of people were living there. But it was part of the gift package for Harrison. And there were hundreds of bottles of whiskey as well that they brought Harrison, and hundreds of cans of sardines that they brought Harrison. And so this notion of the exchange, it's one of the most nuanced but fascinating aspects of this site. And when you compare it with other individuals from the same time period who didn't act deferentially or didn't engage in gift exchange, they were burned off their land. So this act and this initiation of gift giving was very strategic.
Was that where he was getting the bullets from too?
I think so. I think so. And the other thing that's fascinating in terms of trying to track down the bullets is some of these were sold in the catalogs at the time. And that's where it was, you know, one of the unsung stories of Montgomery Ward's, which recently went bankrupt, was those early Montgomery Ward catalogs were some of the only ways for African Americans and other disenfranchised groups to get goods that white businesses wouldn't sell to them. So I do think so, both through gift exchange and through some of these catalogs.
Okay. How was the site protected between your dig seasons?
Um, that's a great question. So if you're familiar with Palomar Mountain, you know that right at like 3,500 feet, there are all these acorn trees, and that's right where the site is. And those trees drop about a foot of leaves and acorns. I mean, they drop more than any other tree that I've seen. And so we went through a few strategies of trying to protect the site. Leaving it open was not a good idea because so much debris fell on it. Um, we tried covering it just with filter fabric so the water could leach through. Palomar Mountain gets more rain than any other spot in San Diego County. That didn't work well because of the runoff. So we developed a system of filter fabric with sandbags with plastic. And that worked really well, except for the Pumacha fire that burned the mountain and melted our plastic and burned all the sandbags. So we still like that strategy the best. But we also have backfilled most of the area to try and let the natural fauna have run of it as well. That's our goal now is to only have a few units open and have the rest of it return to its natural look.
Okay. Do we know who Harrison was writing all those letters to?
So a lot of the letters were from his stepson, who is a fascinating individual, Frederico Sheep Smith, one of the biggest sheep owners in all of Southern California. And he was an individual that it makes sense with Harrison being a shepherd himself and with all the Basque individuals who specialized in herding sheep. But Frederico, his stepson, seems to be one of the key pen pals. And what's great is the tone of the letters. They are definitely a letter from a family member because it scolds him for, not taking good care enough of the sheep. It's only family members can chastise you in that sort of way.
Okay. And one of our last questions, you mentioned about how archaeologists are writing narratives. Do archaeologists have the right to make narratives of their sites?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question, and what blows me away is this is something that nobody talked about 20, 30 years ago. The landscape has changed, the intellectual landscape. So I would say yes, but with a caveat. We do have a right because we are finding a new data set, and it's a data set that we know especially well. We know where these items were found. We know what they are. We have a long knowledge of this material culture. But when we talk about orthogonal thought and a saturation of stories, I think we need to acknowledge that our story isn't the only story. It's not the best story, that it's one of many stories. And one of the reasons that we insist on publishing our data and want everyone else to publish their data is to make that step where we say, this is the sense that we've made of our data, but everyone else has a shot at it too. And if you want to look at all 60,000 artifacts, you want to look at our catalog, have a shot at it and come up with a new narrative. These are very tricky times. And, I think if we're truly going to move away from the colonial roots of archaeology, the buzzword decolonizing archaeology, which is very difficult to do, we have to make those steps in that direction that says we are going to acknowledge other narratives as equal to our own, even though we found the stuff, even though we love the stuff, even though, you'll hear me call it my site or our site. It's everybody's site. And that means equally valid interpretations. That's a great, tough question.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Mallios, for coming tonight, and thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and I hope we see you all at our next talk. So thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.